So on the heels of another semi-controversial program about animal rights, I'm wading into the waters again this week with our guest, author and science lecturer Guy P. Harrison, whose new book is Race and Reality: What Everyone Should Know About Our Biological Diversity. Race and racism are hot-button topics, so much so that when I was reading this book in public, I worried what people thought it was about, that I might be reading a white pride book rather than a book on the science showing that, hold on to your genes, there is biologically no such thing as race. It is not possible, with reproducible consistency acceptable to scientists, to classify even a majority of humans into an agreed-upon finite number of races. This doesn't mean that the idea of race isn't impactful. History shows us that it is, but as a social construct, not a scientific one. I talked with Guy Harrison by phone last week from his home in the Cayman Islands about why this concept is one whose time is long overdue, and the important scientific findings showing how alike we all are seeks to unite us, rather than continue to classify, label, and divide us. Well, so you begin the book with the idea that biological races don't make sense. So let's explain a little bit about what we mean when we say race doesn't really make sense.
Right. It sounds like a bold claim that is almost impossible to believe for many people, but it's actually really common sense once you kind of peel away the layers of nonsense and you see what we're talking about. When anthropologists say races are not real, what they're talking about is biological categories of people, these huge subsets of humanity, like black people, white people, okay? This stuff is completely silly, okay? These are cultural creations. There are no boundaries around people that are consistent or logical that make any sense. And so when they say races aren't real, they're talking about those categories that we think are determined naturally, that nature has imposed on us. But in fact, we've made them up. We imposed races on ourselves. Now, it's so important whenever you say races aren't real. You know, I always quickly add, but cultural race categories are very real, okay? In America, there really is something called black people. There really is something called white people, for example, okay? And they have a lot of serious real-world implications that come along with those categories. So, you know, for example, being a black person in America can bring with it really serious biological consequences for a person's health, you know, because of stress, prejudice, things like that, okay, lifestyle choices, all that kind of stuff. That's very real. But it's not racial in the sense that the everyday person on the street thinks it is. It doesn't have anything to do with one's ancestry reaching back thousands of years, okay? And so what we need to understand is that anthropologists have made a completely solid case for our species being very young, very closely related, and not divided up into these racial groups. And I think if we understand that, I think that's a great way to attack racism rather than, you know, traditionally the way to argue against racism has been to appeal to people's goodness, to say, oh, well, that's mean, let's all be fair and let's be happy and get along and all that. And we've sort of omitted what I think is the most important part of the equation is that, well, racial groups don't make sense anyway in a biological sense. That's how we should be going at it. So when somebody says these people are smarter than those people, these people are better athletes than those people, instead of just saying, well, that's kind of uncomfortable, let's not think that, let's try to all get along and be fair, we need to attack it and say, well, wait a minute, what are these categories? When you say black people, you're referring to about 1 billion people in the world who, if we look closely, we find out are actually not very closely related compared, you know, relatively. You know, for example, there's people in Africa that are genetically more distant from each other than I am to a given African subpopulation. You know, and I would be considered like a white European American. So all this stuff is nonsense, and we really need to get at it. And skepticism has a big role in this, because if you pierce through all that stuff that you're taught by culture to believe in, and if you learn a little science, you come out realizing, wow, we are one big, closely related family, and these big walls of race that are everywhere are just imaginary. They're not really there.
Yeah, it's a bold statement. It's a lot to take in, but when you break it down the way that you have in the book, explaining not only the science behind it, but even the reality of it, it does start to make a lot of sense. So simply put, we are one species, and that's it. We are all 99.9% alike. And so considering how different we all are as individual people, it's not surprising that most people wouldn't believe or wouldn't want to believe that race doesn't make sense. So how do we try and communicate, like you've done in this book, what is positive about what makes us more alike than different?
Well, okay, first of all, I'm all for individuality, and this book, no anthropologist would ever say we're all identical, even though we are very closely related, okay? Compared to other species in the world, we are a very closely related species, okay? And then part of the reason for that is because we're very young, okay? The first modern humans only date back to about 200,000 years ago, okay? That's not a long time ago, really, okay, compared to many other life forms on this planet. We're really young and kind of a tightly knit, intertwined species. Now, we do look a lot different. Some of us are very dark, some of us very light, okay? And then but those are superficial traits, I should add, that came relatively recent and not a big deal, okay? Skin color, nose dimensions, hair type, none of that has anything to do with intelligence or morality or anything like that. But the thing is, what we've got to keep in mind is that race fools us, okay? It fools us because we think, well, wait a minute, look at the differences in these people. They're so different. But a lot of what we see as differences is cultural, okay? The way people talk, the language, the accent, the gods they worship, the foods they eat, the way they dress, a lot of that. And it tends to trick us, okay? Our perceptions get a bit off track because we bundle that up in our minds as being somehow biologically rooted. So when we go to, we travel to the Pacific or Asia or Africa or someplace, throughout Europe, and we see these different people, and you have to strip away all the cultural stuff and then get down to what's really different. And when we find out what's really different, it's really just, like I said, hair, skin color, stuff like that, okay? There's nothing fundamentally really, really significantly different about us. We are really connected. We are close. And couple of quick examples I'll give you really fast. It helps people understand what anthropologists mean when they say races aren't real. These are cultural constructions. Imagine this. Imagine if we had a time machine, okay? And let's imagine we get a white Irish person. We put him in this time machine, and we send him back to America, say the 1840s, okay? Now, when this white Irish person steps out of the time machine, guess what? He's no longer white. Somehow, he magically became a non-white Irish person. Now, how did that happen? His DNA didn't change. His ancestry didn't change. What happened? His skin is the same color. What happened is the race rules changed, okay? There was a period in American history where white Irish people, we would think of them as white Irish people, getting off boats in New York City were not designated as white people. They just weren't up to the standards or whatever, okay? Now, eventually, they became white people in America, okay? I guess they lobbied for it or something. I don't know how they achieved that, but they eventually did. Now, that shows, see, if race is some biologically imposed reality, then you shouldn't be able to change it just by skipping back a century in time. But the fact is, the race rules have always changed over time, and they always will change over time as long as we believe them. And another good example is this, say I live in the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean here, and there are many light-skinned, what would be described in America as light-skinned people, okay? That I could take one of these people here, and they would say, no, I'm not a black person. They might call themselves Caymanian race or something like that, but they would not refer to themselves as black people, okay? Not that anything's wrong with that, but that's just kind of a common thing among many people here. But if I put one of those people on a plane and flew them to, say, Mississippi or Alabama, okay, right now, today, when they got off the plane, if they asked 100 people, 100 people would say, yeah, you're black. You're a black person. You're African-American, they would assume, or something like that. Now, what happened? How can you be one race in one country and another race in another country? What happens at 30,000 feet up in the clouds? Does something magic go on? No. Just the race rules change. Same with Brazil. Brazil has a very elaborate system of racial designations. And some black people in America would fly to Brazil and they would not be considered black in Brazil, And there's no consistency to that. That's why most anthropologists have rejected this whole idea of race, because it's just illogical and it's inconsistent, and it's very dangerous. It misleads us. It pushes us apart in ways that are unjustified.
Well, and when you talk about anthropologists accepting that race is more or less a worldview and not a true way to classify humans, what is some of the anthropologic evidence, some of the scientific evidence that have been used to help support this idea?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of, in fact, as far as I'm concerned, all the evidence supports the idea that we do not have these vast canyons between us as people. There's not some huge gulf between what's called white people and black people. It just doesn't exist. And that's what the evidence shows. I mean, in a society like America, which is very race conscious and has a really, really kind of a tormented past over this whole race concept with slavery, segregation, lynching, and all these things, prejudice. I mean, it's very tough to see in a place like America because it's such a contrast. You've got, white people and black people have been in conflict for so long. But when you look at the global perspective and you look at the actual scientific evidence, when you look at the evidence, you look at the fossils, where we come from, who we are, when you look at the genetic evidence that shows our true relationship, okay, when you see all that, when you understand it, and it's not that hard. It's not theoretical physics or anything. I mean, any kid can understand it, But when you see this stuff, when you really comprehend it, you realize, my gosh, this is just a cultural game. I mean, this is, science is screaming to us that, hey, like I said earlier, we are one big family here. We may be dysfunctional, but we're one big family. And we need to get over this imaginary thing of thinking that we're so we treat each other like we're these subspecies that come from different planets or something. And it's absolutely ridiculous. It really is.
Well, you were mentioning the differences between other places and the United States, which is very race conscious. And you've lived and worked and traveled all over the world. So in your experience, is race more of an issue in the United States than many of the other places you've lived and worked?
Yeah, yes and no. I would say yes in that traditional kind of that real conflict between these primary race groups that we think of, like blacks and whites and Spanish, which, by the way, Spanish is a ridiculous language. It's a ridiculous biological category, which many people still think it is. But the thing is, when you go to other countries, okay, it's not like they don't have race problems. They have other problems, okay, that are really race problems as well. They're just expressed in a different way. And a lot of times, people who are not really sensitive to this kind of thing won't even notice it, For example, I have a thing in my book where I interviewed a woman who barely survived the massacres in Rwanda back in 1994. And, to the outsider, to the American, it was just black people killing black people. It was, Africans killing Africans, some tribal conflict or whatever. But talking to her and researching it, guess what? I discovered it was absolutely a racial conflict. It was race belief rearing its ugly head again and causing thousands of people to be killed. Because she explained to me, I mean, I was a bit surprised. I was stunned. I couldn't believe it because she explained to me as a child, okay, this Rwanda woman, that before the massacre really exploded, she was had to go to school, had to stand up in class and identify herself by her tribe, okay? And the other kids would look at her like horribly, like with disgust, and the teacher would pass horrible comments about her, and she was, picked on in the playground. And she starts telling me how there was constant propaganda in newspapers and on the radio about her people as opposed to the other people. And I was like, my gosh, as a writer, I've interviewed many survivors of the Holocaust, Jewish people. And her story sounded exactly like many of the stories I've heard from Holocaust survivors in Europe. I mean, she was talking about how they were separated, they were degraded, they were identified, they were threatened. I mean, it was like just a complete, rerun of the Holocaust in Rwanda. And the thing is, at the core of it was race belief. Even to you or I, they would just look like black people, black African. But actually, to them, they were very different. The Hutus were considered to be more muscular and stronger, and the Tutsis were considered to be taller, leaner, more beautiful, and had more fine features. And the bloodlines were even though they had intermarrying and they lived together, worked together, there was still this belief of this vast difference, this really crucial and important genetic difference between these two kinds of human. So it was really no different from black people and white people in, the 1800s in the American South. I mean, it was the same kind of thing. It's this unwarranted belief in these biological differences. And the thing is, we don't need that. You know, we as humans, we're so creative. We can find plenty of reasons to hate each other and kill each other without having to imagine all this biological stuff. So we need to really just let this baggage go and accept who we are. I think we'd be a lot better off.
Oh, I think that's something that pretty much everybody could get behind. And of course, the staunch humanist that I am, this is the perfect idea. The way to classify humans is just that, as Homo sapiens, that we're all the same. And it seems like such a simple concept on its face, but obviously it's a problem that persists no matter, despite the evidence. So how do we make this change? It's a mammoth change on something so simple. We've been trying to do it, you know, for so long, and how do we do it? It's just, I mean, that's the question, I guess, but how do we start to change people's ideas about what race is and what it isn't?
Well, the world-class skeptic that you are, you will absolutely agree with this, I know. I think we need much more science education, okay? Starting early and all the way through school, I mean, much more. Because the levels of science literacy, science awareness are just so low in the U.S. and around the world. I mean, it's terrible. People focus on the whole evolution creation debate and that stuff. But the problem is, you know, it's a lot worse than that. I mean, I read a stat, I think something like 40% of Americans don't know that it takes 1 year for the Earth to revolve around the sun, you know, things like that. I mean, it's just, we're not learning enough science. And I spoke to one of the anthropologists I interviewed for this book, Race and Reality. He told me that he has a real problem because by the time students reach him in university, and he's got them in his anthropology class, and he's explaining to them the realities of human diversity, biological diversity, and he's explaining to them that these racial groups are not really what you think they are, and he's trying to, you know, he's lecturing on this topic. He says 2/3 of the class just zones out. They cannot comprehend what he's talking about. And he says it's like it's chiseled. Race belief is so deeply chiseled into their minds they can't overcome it. And he says we really need to teach basic anthropology at like the kindergarten level, first grade, second grade, and start there because, you know, maybe he's being pessimistic, but, you know, he's in the front lines, and he says that many people, they just can't see their way past race belief once it's, you know, in that deep at a certain age. So I don't know. I mean, I think that's probably what we have to do. We have to explain to children, you know, at early ages. And I don't mean, you know, indoctrinate them into, you know, some kind of happy, feel-good sort of thing where everybody's equal and let's all get along and all that. Nothing like that. I'm talking about just the reality, the scientific truth, the reality. That's what we've got to get at, you know. Because by the way, let me add, you know, because a lot of real hardcore fundamentalist race believers, they have a hard time with this whole rejection of race. And I don't know, for whatever reason, they've got a lot invested in racial categories and they don't want to let go. And they get the wrong impression as to what's being said, okay? Anthropologists are not saying that because races aren't real, that means every individual has the same intellectual potential, has the same exact, you know, physical potential. Doesn't mean that at all. We all have individual talents. We all have different potential for different things. We are, you know, we are different, okay? We make choices. We have different ways in life and all that. Nobody's denying that, okay? And there is diversity in our species. And there is some, you know, obvious. You can look at many people and you can make a pretty good guess about their continent of origin. You know, you can make a good guess. You might be wrong a lot, though, okay? For example, I could fool people easily by handpicking a few Fijians or a few people from Papua New Guinea that I would put in front of you and say, is this person from Africa, true or false? And most people would say, yes, Africa, but they're not. There are people on some Pacific islands that, you know, would fool any American into thinking they're African or African American, you know, but they're not. In fact, they're very distantly related to Africans, okay? I would be more closely related to some Africans than they would be, despite the fact that they have dark skin, they have hair tied more like an African, okay? That shows how our eyes can be fooled. But the thing is, we've got to get past these superficial traits. We've got to learn the science, and I think we've got to do it early on. And we've got to spread skepticism, you know. Good skepticism is all about asking questions. It's about being courageous enough to challenge authority when it might be wrong, you know. I mean, that's what this is about. You need to ask hard questions. You need to ask people in charge. You need to ask our government. The census form that's coming out now,
it's a great time to mention the census, because I think there actually is a rising interest in the topic of race, in that, you know, there have been so many people out there who talk about the census and discuss it. But I mean, as it's constitutionally mandated, most of us have just completed our 2010 U.S. Census that asks us to identify ourselves by race. And why is that data important if race itself doesn't really exist, for one thing? And also what I found was interesting was President Obama decided to mark himself as Black or African American on his census.
Right. Which is interesting because, you know, Obama, as the child of a white mother and a Black Kenyan father, actually has far less in common with most African Americans than anybody would think. Okay, in fact, his white mother probably is the source of his more common kinship with typical Black Americans than his father, because Africa has so much genetic diversity. Okay, that's the oldest continent. That's where we all come from. We've been there the longest, and they've got the most genetic diversity. And most Black Americans trace their ancestry back to West Africa or Central Africa. Okay, Obama traces his father on his father's side. His ancestry goes back to East Africa, which is a big difference genetically. Okay, between East and West in Africa. So Obama actually, I mean, like if he is probably less related. I bet he is less related to many African Americans because of his Black father, and more related to many African Americans because of his white mother. And that's completely weird and bizarre and upside down sounding, but that's true. That's true. And you know, in the 2000 census, 40% of Americans checked other for race. 40%. That's incredible. And that's, you know, actually, I view that as a sign of hope, because it shows people, it's clicking in people's head that, wait a minute, something's not quite right here, you know, because sometimes race is a nationality, sometimes it's even a religion with Jewish people, sometimes race is a color. I mean, it's not consistent, you know, sometimes it's a language, Spanish. I mean, come on, you know, it doesn't make sense. But let me say this, Swoopy, it is still important, okay? The American Sociological Association issued a statement on this because, like the anthropologists, they've awakened to the reality that these racial categories are not biologically sound. However, they said, you know what? Society in America and in other countries is so wrapped up in race, okay, and it's got so much history there that it still has all these echoes we're hearing now, that we can't just say, okay, no more race, let's never speak of it again, erase it from all the paperwork, we're done with that, let's move on. Because that would actually probably harm a lot of people who need some help. If not directly, they need different social policies, they need something to be changed, they need more studies done. We need to have a better understanding of the roots of the problems that we're facing. So if you have, for example, say with Native Americans, okay, they have a lot of health problems the rest of the population doesn't have at all. And the thing is, a lot of those health problems are rooted in them being Native Americans, all right? So they need to be identified. We need to be able to study these. We need to crunch the numbers and figure out what's going on, okay? Now, even if a race category like Spanish or Black or even Native American doesn't make a whole lot of sense biologically, okay, we still need it sociologically in order to confront these challenges we still have as a society. So I think we're still stuck with the idea of race on forms for a while. But I love the fact that nobody writing these forms can figure out a way to do it that makes sense, and half the people that are, you know, filling out the forms can't quite figure out what they're supposed to put. That shows that we are kind of waking up as a species, I think, I hope.
Well, and I don't think most people want to be classified and put into any one particular box. So that also lends hope, I think, that more people who want to identify themselves as just, you know, human, is just a person, that they don't want to necessarily be in one of those boxes.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I actually write about that in my book, where I say, you know, to call myself a white person, it just can't work with me, because I've learned the true human story. You know, I've been to Africa, I've been to Olduvai Gorge, you know, I've been sitting in anthropology classes, I've interviewed archaeologists and paleoanthropologists, you know, I've been all over the world, and I know the human story is so vast and beautiful and complex, how we were this tiny population in Africa, okay, of modern humans, just a little while ago, really, by Earth time. And somehow, you know, we were smart enough, we were lucky enough, we were creative enough, tough enough to survive. Some of us migrated out of Africa, and we spread around the world over thousands of years. You know, we made it. We made it in all these different environments. We survived. That's such a cool, great story. And I'm connected to that whole story. And to call me a white person, you know, or to call somebody a black person or an Asian, you know, it's not, it cheapens you. It's cutting you off, you know. It's like, I've always told people that when, like, I have a degree in history, and I love history, and I feel connected to it all because, you know, if it's not my direct ancestors, well, it was my cousins doing whatever I'm reading about or whatever I'm studying or whatever historical place I visit, you know, these people are my cousins doing this stuff here, and I feel a connection to it. And I wish everybody felt that, you know. It's like in the American South with slavery, you know. Well, I feel shame, you know. I mean, I don't feel any direct guilt, but I feel sad, say, to know that possibly some of my ancestors were slaveholders or involved in some way directly with the slave trade. You know, I have ancestors who are in South Carolina, so maybe I do. You know, and I feel kind of creepy about that and bad. But you know what? I also feel a sense of kind of horror and sadness for the black slaves, because I'm connected to them too. You know, I don't feel like I'm just on one side of the equation. And I think black Americans should feel the same way, you know, especially as genetically diverse as black Americans are, you know, with the huge ratio of white European ancestry they have in that subpopulation. They should also feel that way. They should feel connected to both the slave master and the slaves. I mean, because all these things are part of the human story. And whenever you try to define yourself as one little color, one little race, I mean, you're chopping out 90% of your story, and you're shortchanging yourself. You know, you should feel disgust and pride in the whole human story, all the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, embrace it all.
It's interesting to note, and maybe it's inspired by the census, that there have been a range of new television programs on tracing people's origins. One of the ones I watched that I enjoyed is a PBS program called Faces of America with Henry Louis Gates, and he actually connected with several different prominent people from all walks of life, and they traced them genetically, and they actually utilized their DNA to determine where their origins lie, down to what migratory group in Africa or Asia your ancestors ultimately came from. And talking about relating to everyone, I mean, that's amazing science that tells us how we're all related.
I've actually done that as well. I've done that, and it was a beautiful thing for me. I write about this in the book as well. It was a beautiful thing for me to see lined up on this map, like charted out on this world map, where I could see the vague sort of path my ancestors took, you know, originating in Africa. And I was like, wow, you know, cool, I'm African. And then my ancestors made it into Europe, and I was, you know, wow, I'm European. And they actually skirted the edge of Asia, and I could say, hey, wow, I'm Asian, you know. And then in historic times, my ancestors migrated from Europe to America, you know, which is kind of where I pick up the story and kind of know people. But the thing is, it's a great thing. Everybody should be aware of this story, and sadly, they're not. You know, it's heartbreaking to me that a typical person on the street, if you ask them, they don't know how old modern humans are, how long we've been around. Very basic questions. They don't know when people migrated out of Africa. They don't know how they did it, how long it took. They don't know. You know, it's no surprise that people believe so deeply in these biological race categories, because they don't know the human story, and they don't understand the relationship, and they don't know how, you know, they don't understand how people got around from Asia into North America, South America, and the Caribbean. They don't know these things. And to me, this is such a wonderful and inspirational story. I mean, it really is. It's a great story. And yet, for some reason, it's not taught in you know, elementary schools and in high schools. It's generally not taught. I guess maybe it's a conflict with some religions. I don't know why it has to be that, but I'm not sure why. Maybe it's just general science literacy problems. But I think if, like I said earlier, if people understood where we come from, who we are, then this concept of race would really, really start to lose a lot more ground than it already has.
We talk about all of the benefits, but there are some things that we've learned that may be, you know, not as warm and fuzzy. I mean, one of the big questions when it comes to discussion about race revolves around perceived advantages of certain societies over others, which was the dominant theme of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. And you talk about that in your book, too. So what have we learned about the true nature of why some cultures were able to easily dominate and subjugate others, if not based on racial benefits?
Yeah, that's a good question. I did a chapter on that because I've noticed throughout my life that many times discussing race with people, people who are outright racist or people who just kind of lean that way a little bit, believing in white superiority in this case, they would say, well, look at Africa. Look at the poverty in Africa. Look at the mess that Africa is, okay? Sub-Saharan Africa is, a basket case. That's what they would say. And they would say, and then look at history. Why were white people from Europe able to conquer so many black and brown people and able to colonize them and exploit them so easily? I mean, you have Pizarro and a handful of Spanish men were able to bring down the whole Inca Empire. How can this happen? Look at the Aztecs. A handful of men did that, from Europe. How? And the thing is, there was never really a good answer to that, because usually those who didn't want to be racist would just have to change the subject or something. I don't know. There wasn't really a good answer to that. And Jared Diamond, in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel, he drew from many different disciplines, and he put together a pretty good answer to that question. Okay, why were Eurasians, specifically, able to do so well historically? Why were they able to come to the New World and really just, kick people around and have their way? Why? Were they smarter? Were they? And he didn't think so. And turns out he came up with a really good response. Now, any good historian will say, hold on, red alert, watch out. You can't, be careful whenever you try to have a simple answer for an extremely complex problem. We're looking for trouble, okay? So I don't present Jared Diamond's answer as the answer, okay? But I think it is a good counterpunch that people should be aware of. Now, he basically, real quick, here's what it is. He's saying that the people of Eurasia were not smarter. They were just luckier, because in their environment, okay, they had a much better, they had an abundance of natural resources relative to other continents as far as, say, natural grasses that were fairly easy to domesticate, and, like wheat, to make bread and stuff. And they also had a huge advantage on animals that were relatively easy to domesticate, the pigs, the horses, all that stuff. Now, other continents, bad luck. I mean, it turns out, like the Americas, all they had really was the llama and the alpaca. That was it, okay? No horses, no cows. They had none of that stuff that could be domesticated. Africa, none of the really good animals for domestication, all right? Now, Africa's got big animals. They've got elephants. They've got lions. They've got giraffes and all that. So why didn't they just domesticate them? Well, some species just do not take to human domestication, okay? They don't take to it. And the proof of that was, and it wasn't because the Africans weren't smart enough to do it, because even when Europeans came to those regions, they couldn't domesticate those animals either, okay? And don't confuse taming an animal with domesticating a species, because yes, you could tame an elephant, say, to do labor for you and help you work, but that doesn't mean you've domesticated the species, okay? You have to start from scratch on another young elephant, when it's born. But as far as like a horse, those are goats, pigs, those sheep, those kind of things, the Eurasians had a big advantage. With these advantages came civilization, okay? They had a big head start on, cities. And when you get cities, population booms. You've got stratification of labor. You've got all this stuff, and you're off to the races. And additionally to that, you're also exposed to a lot of germs, okay? Many of our deadly diseases, the most deadly diseases throughout history, jumped over from animals like the pigs and stuff like that. And so Europeans and Asians had a head start. They were exposed to these germs and these germs early on. And that's why when they went to the New World a lot of times, they didn't have to rely on their guns and their swords. A lot of times just their sneezes and their coughs wiped out the majority of the people in front of them. So a lot of times they were really trying to do battle with societies that were already being decimated by disease. So they had a huge advantage there. So anyway, that's a really, really good answer, although it will probably be refined and altered and repeatedly challenged, as the years go by. But it makes it hard to argue now without you can't just ignore that. It's strong enough. You have to bring it out. Anybody who says, well, white people were able to colonize the New World because they're just smarter. Well, maybe not. Maybe they had a huge head start because they're lucky, okay? One more thing, Eurasia is favorably shaped even. It's more horizontal. You can kind of imagine it, as opposed to, say, North and South America, which are kind of vertical, okay, or Africa, which is kind of vertical, if you think about it. Now, what that means is, say a person finds a really good plant up in Maine, okay, some tribe up in Maine or New England state, somewhere up in there, finds a really good plant that grows well there. Well, they can't really, probably not going to have success trading with somebody down in Argentina and saying, yeah, grow this, it'll go well, because the latitudes are so different that that plant probably won't survive and it won't do as well there. Whereas in Eurasia, if you stay within the same general latitude, you can trade, and the people 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles away are probably going to have similar success as you did because you're at a similar latitude, similar weather and stuff. So you can trade seeds back and forth, and that technology works. It goes, that information, the agricultural knowledge can transfer really, really rapidly and successfully.
Yeah, it just all kind of comes down to those Eurasian people who came to subjugate these other cultures. They just had a better head start, and they had tons and tons of environmental advantages that the other races didn't have. And, it's never been proven, as far as I can read from all of the research and things that you point out in your book, that there is any disparity in intelligence between different so-called races.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There has never, despite a lot of effort, okay, no scientist has ever found a gene-based link between intelligence and a biological race category. Never happened, okay? And there's so many examples of, say, in the United States, you have, black children who take intelligence tests in the American South, okay, back in the 50s. But then if their families migrate to the American North, they suddenly, their scores a year or two later jump up, 15 points or something. Did crossing the Mason-Dixon line somehow enhance their brains or whatever? No, I think it's probably because they suddenly had access to better schools. They were getting better teachers maybe or something like that. That's probably what it is. Or maybe they were more comfortable or got better nutrition. The thing is, you can't, when you seat two people at a table and you give them an intelligence test, each one of them, okay, yes, you can make judgments perhaps about those two people. Now, you could argue about innate intelligence being testable by test, okay? You could argue that, but you could at least test them to their knowledge or whatever. But to make some kind of sweeping judgment about their race, and say, well, okay, we gave 50 people this test and 50 darker skinned people this test, and they scored average here, this, average there, this, and then make a judgment about entire races of people, hundreds of millions of people, and it's just ridiculous. And then because these groups don't come to the table with the same life experiences, okay? Some were mistreated, some didn't get the proper food, some are intimidated and scared, some there's one guy who gave a test. He investigated this whole thing about intelligence tests in America being culturally biased. And it was amazing what he did. His name was Fagan. He took black kids and white kids, and he gave them a test. And sure enough, the white kids averaged several points higher than the black kids. But then he changed the test, okay? He switched around a few words here and there and used vocabulary words that are common within the black subculture of America. And he gave them tests like that, okay? A test like that, based that way, so it was slanted more towards them linguistically. Now, guess what? The black kids scored 10, 15 points higher than the white kids. Suddenly they became the superior race just because he changed a word here and there, okay? Now, what was really interesting is when he used words, he went through it and he made sure it was absolutely neutral as far as vocabulary. There was no questions about yachting or tennis clubs or golfing or anything, okay? He tried to make it really race neutral, as much as he could, culturally neutral. And the race disparity vanished. Kids, you couldn't separate two groups out of the whole testing pool. Suddenly there was no racial difference just because he worked and figured out a way to make it race neutral. So to me, that shows little things like that can just have a big impact, and it has nothing to do with. And I mean, think about what you're saying when you say, okay, black people score on average lower on an IQ test than white Americans, therefore black people are not as smart. That's crazy, because you're saying something about their blackness, something about their ancestry stretching back 50,000 years to that continent has somehow smothered their intellectual potential. And that is such a far-fetched thing compared to saying, well, maybe it's because they've grown up in a society with a severe problem of racism and prejudice and segregation, and could that possibly explain it? I think that's a much more obvious explanation as far as I'm concerned. I mean, you have to eliminate that before you reach that mysterious genetic explanation that so many people want to believe. I'll give you an example. Kenya. There's a book I read by a guy who's promoting this idea of IQ tests prove that white people are superior and all that. And he's got in there these national IQ averages for various countries. And for Kenya, he had 72. 72, according to his research, is the IQ average for Kenyans. All right. Well, 71, I believe, is the marking point for mentally retarded. Okay. And I've been to Kenya, and believe me, it's not a nation that's filled with mentally retarded people. I mean, they're alert, they're intelligent. It's just incredible that somebody could promote that kind of an idea, And the thing is, you go to Kenya, you go to some rural village, you gather up a bunch of high school kids, and you hand them some intelligence test made by somebody in New York City or something. I mean, I doubt they're going to do as well as some kids in Utah or Wisconsin who went to great schools and are exposed to that sort of thinking. Whereas, I interviewed one psychologist, the New York psychologist in my book, and he talked about when he went and lived among some Arizona Indians, and he was just so incompetent and couldn't figure out half the stuff they asked him to do. He said he felt like an idiot the whole time. And he said, it made him understand that once you're slightly misplaced or severely misplaced in this culture, out of your culture, when you're misplaced, and you're a bit disoriented out of your natural surroundings that you're familiar with, you just become sort of a bumbling fool and you lose confidence. And he said if they had given him an intelligence test in that Indian society, he would have scored as mentally challenged, no doubt. And it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, I think basically anybody who has to watch like one episode of The Amazing Race to prove your point, because all of these people are thrown into situations all around the world that are completely foreign to them. And despite, it's amazing what goes on with people who in their own environment are more than reasonably intelligent. And it's the simplest things that all of the people in those environments take for granted, getting around or transportation or food, and they can't cope. And so it's certainly a question of environment, and people, as you say, have to be better skeptics and just ask the right questions when faced with statistics like one race is smarter than another race. It's also interesting. I mean, you have to think about the things that have happened because of these kinds of implications of race. If you tell a white kid that he can't jump or a black kid that he can't float, and this is something you said in your book, based on these disproven stereotypes based on race, you are limiting that kid's experiences and potential for life simply on something that doesn't even exist.
Yeah, exactly. I had a lot of fun, actually, with the chapter on sports because, most people, probably 99.9% of Americans, would agree with the statement, black people are superior runners. They would say yes, of course, because if you watch the Olympics these days, at least the last 20 years or so, you see black guys, black men and women winning the sprints. You see black men and women winning the distance events. And you think, well, gosh, the black people are just naturally born great runners. That's what else could explain it, But guess what? That's not true. That's not true. Because the statement black people are great runners, it makes no sense because the category of black people is way too diverse to just to think of in that way. The sprinters that have had recent success in the short events in the Olympics have all been drawn from a very small subgroup of so-called black people. They're West Africans, and they're the descendants of West Africans that are in Europe and America and Canada. Okay, small group. Okay, you can't find hardly any competent sprinters in East Africa. Okay, white Europeans are far outperforming East Africans in the short sprints. Okay, and the reverse is true of the distance events. Okay, typical black Americans, West Africans, Central Africans, they're very poor in distance running. Okay, white Europeans and white Americans are better than them at distance events. And then when you look at the success of Africans, East Africans, in distance running, Okay, it makes no sense to see them standing up on the medal podium at the Olympic Games and draw a conclusion. Wow, black people are great runners. That guy just smoked that 10,000 meters. He's awesome. It doesn't make any sense because even those runners, it's not even limited to East Africa. They're actually drawn from very small areas, very small regions within Kenya and within Ethiopia. Okay, when I was in Kenya, for example, speaking with other Kenyans, people who are in the Kikuyu tribe from Nairobi and stuff, they speak of these Kenyans who win in the Olympics with awe and just amazement, and they talk of them as if they are of a different race. They don't feel genetically close to them at all. They do nationally, but not genetically close at all. They feel like they are something special. This tribe up in the Great Rift Valley, these people are something bizarre and wonderful, and they're just great runners. They look at them as the way you or I would, as these special people, and they certainly don't group them as like black people are great runners. That's the thing. Once you look a little deeper into these questions, you start to see it doesn't really hold up the way we view things. Like with basketball in America, with the NBA, basketball is a black sport, right? Well, no, not really. I mean, for some reason, white guys, although Duke just won a national championship with a bunch of white guys, but the thing is, it doesn't break down racially the way people think it does, okay? First of all, the great black players, Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, most people will watch them play and said, oh, those guys just gifted, born, natural talents. And they think it's something about their blackness that made them great. Well, the real story is Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson worked harder than anybody. I mean, those guys were hard workers. Magic Johnson was practicing 2 hours before school every day when he was like 8 years old, okay? And if he was so talented, why did he have to work so hard, okay? I think a lot of that is work and not so much talent. And white Europeans seem to be able to play basketball very well, and many of them are popping up in the ADA. Now, genetically, they're not that different from white Americans, so what's going on? It must be some kind of weird cultural thing happening there. Okay, white Americans are all skateboarding now or something. Maybe that explains it. I don't know. Okay? But the thing is, sports is a great thing to look at with race because it lies to our eyes in so many ways, and through confirmation bias, we get fooled, and we see this and believe that, and we see that and ignore it and keep believing these myths. But I had a lot of fun with that chapter. I mean, that's a good one because there's so many things that people just think is absolute common sense. But once they see it from another angle, they kind of, hopefully the lights go on and they go, wow, that's not right, yeah.
Yeah, you can only think about some really interesting examples when you think about race and sports, and I just have two words: Tiger Woods. I mean, there's just you could do a whole chapter just on Tiger Woods in the race of sports. Yeah, I really enjoyed reading.
Yeah. And not even his sex life either.
Yeah, no, you wouldn't even have to go there. Well,
that'd be another chapter.
Yeah. You discussed the topic of interracial relationships from firsthand experience. So what effect does your family have on your passion for this subject, and has it raised any controversy within your extended family?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I'm so down it's weird. I'm so down the road on race now. I mean, and I was when I met my wife. To describe her, it's kind of, I guess maybe in some places people would look at her and say, oh, she's black, but to me, it's not really a good description. She's got, I think, a grandfather who's Scottish, a grandfather who's Chinese. Her mother is what we call Black Caribbean. Okay, her father is half Jamaican, black, half Chinese. So she's a real mixture. She's sort of a Tiger Woods kind of person. You know what I mean? So she's to me, she's just the world. She's a beautiful mix of humanity, and she's just a beautiful woman. And I don't even really think of her. It's hard, when I think of, but people remind me I'm in an interracial relationship, and it kind of strikes me as odd, and I have to remember, oh yeah, right, I forgot, because I mean, she is just a person to me. I kind of forget that. But yeah, I can't really say. We've lived in the Caribbean, so here in the Cayman Islands, this is a very sort of mixed kind of place, all kinds of people. I mean, it's a small population of less than 100,000, but there's easily over 100 nationalities represented here, so it's a very, very diverse population. So, we don't turn heads or anything like that walking around, it's nothing at all. And our children are just, beautiful children. I mean, the whole concept of an interracial child is to me absurd, we're all really sort of interracial. I mean, it doesn't really, just carry any weight with me. I don't really think about it much. And so in writing this chapter about interracial love and relationships and all that, it really was weird for me to try to be sort of detached from it and explain why this doesn't make sense and all. Because to me, it's so silly to even have to explain this. But the thing is, the reason interracial love should not even be an issue is because there's no such thing as pure races. When they were making a big deal out of preventing people in Virginia, for example, from falling in love and getting married, and it became a Supreme Court case in 1967, the Loving v. Virginia case. I mean, they already, the cat was out of the bag, okay? There's so much mixture going on in America. It's just ridiculous, It's why you're fighting a lost battle, It's only in your minds that you're trying to preserve this thing. And it's, well, I don't think interracial marriage, some people think interracial marriage is somehow can save the world or anything like that. I don't think that at all. I mean, I don't. I just think it will be a wonderful thing when people are less inhibited, less restricted, and they just naturally drift and fall in love and go wherever they want to go as far as relationships. Because when you in your mind, when you restrict yourself to what kind of person you're going to date or what kind of person you're going to marry, I mean, you're cutting out 80% of humanity, I mean, that's crazy. I mean, all my life I've dated every version of woman you can imagine, and I think my life has been richer for it, I mean, I've dated white girls, black girls, I mean, Asians, I mean, just everything. And the thing is, it's made my life so much more enjoyable because I've known more kinds of people. I've learned more things about other people. I've been exposed to other attitudes, other worldviews, other cultures, and it's just a beautiful thing. It's made me more appreciative of my species rather than, being just walking through life with blinders on and only looking for blondes and nothing else. I mean, I'm glad I haven't lived my life that way. I really have.
Well, and it just makes sense because, as you point out, the reason that race isn't an issue because we're all related and we're all so diverse is because, our ancestors did that. They migrated and they mixed with one another, and that didn't really matter. And so it's silly that it should matter now who we fall in love with or who we choose to be with or start a family with when that's the way that we all came to be the same.
Yeah, I found a funny thing, too. A recent article in the journal Nature just showed up on my mailbox a couple of weeks ago. It was an article about scientists mapped 5 human genomes in southern Africa, and 2 of them were of African Bushmen. Okay, these 2 guys, and they lived within walking distance of each other. And to you or I, they would look like, not only would they look like they were in the same tribe, they would look like they could be brothers, in the same family or something to, a typical American. That's how they would look. Same color, same hair, that kind of stuff. But guess what they found? By studying their genomes, they found that these 2 guys were more distantly related than, say, a typical white European and a typical Asian, Japanese person or Chinese person. Think about that, okay? A typical white European and a typical Asian are more distantly related than these 2 African guys who live within walking distance of each other in Africa. And that shows how our eyes can be fooled by these superficial traits. And if somebody was really hung up on who you should date, you should stick within your own race, right? Because kinship matters, because genetics and blood are really important. Well, they would make a huge mistake because they would say, well, these two Bushmen, their people should all mate and stay together because they're the same kind of people. Well, they're not. Beneath the skin, they're not. They're actually, you could argue they should be put in different races despite how similar they look, based on their genetics, based on their real kinship. Maybe you should separate them and put the French guy and the Japanese guy in the same race together despite how they look differently to us. Because the genetics tell a totally different story from what our eyes tell us. And that's why it's just silly. I mean, and in America, it's really absurd when you have people like, you have very light-skinned people who identify themselves as black people or African Americans. And that's fine if that's what they want to identify themselves, but that's a cultural designation. And it's silly to really imagine that it's biological, it's about the blood, It's crazy. And when you base, you say, I will only date people in this race and not that race because of blood. It's absolutely silly.
So I assume that now, because one of the most important things that we have realized is that we need to just spread the word about what we know scientifically, what we know anthropologically, what we know to be true about what race is and isn't, that you're going to be spending time letting as many people know and talk about your book as possible. But what are you planning to do next? Because I enjoyed your first book, 50 Reasons People Give for Believing in a God, and I've really enjoyed this book. What's your next topic that you're planning to write about?
Yeah, that's. I'm actually waiting to hear word back from my publisher right now. I've got a proposal, and I'm trying to. You're going to love this too. It's a book on skepticism.
Woo!
I'm trying to do a book. I won't say the title yet because we're still kind of arguing back and forth about what the title is going to be. And they always have the final word, so I'll just wait on the title. But it's basically what I'm doing is a sort of a grand tour of wild popular beliefs, okay, astrology, all the regular ones. I've come up with a list of things that are really, really common beliefs that just are not based. They don't have any evidence supporting them. They have got no reason, no good arguments behind them, and yet they maintain their popularity, year after year after year. And so I've got it all in there. Area 51, Roswell, I've got all that stuff. But the way I'm trying to address it is sort of like 50 Reasons People Give for Believing in a God. I'm trying to be really nice about it and just go after the beliefs without making believers feel too uncomfortable, because I want them to actually read it without hating me and burning the book. So I'm trying to do it that way, and I'm also trying to make it write it in a way that people who are already, good hardcore skeptics will get a lot out of it as well, because I share my experiences in interviewing these people and talking with them and arguing with them, and I kind of, I'm telling what works, what doesn't work, and how, a lot of times, for a quick example, biblical archaeology. I've interviewed many, many deeply religious people, and somewhere along the way they'll throw in, and archaeology has confirmed, our religion as being true. And rather than say, oh, that's not true, and launch into a big argument with them, I've got this technique where I simply ask them a question. I say, really? Wow, that's amazing. Really? I'm surprised to hear that. And I say, what is the number one archaeological find that really confirms something supernatural, about within your religion? Something that's not just about a person or a place, but something supernatural. What's the number one find? And right away they will just struggle because they know there's never been such a find has never been made. There's no such archaeological discovery that confirms anything supernatural. So that their inability to answer that question teaches them a lesson, and it does it without me having to be like this bully, know-it-all, condescending jerk who had to, rain on their parade or something. So this is little techniques like that I've learned along the way, that you can get people to think, and you can kind of encourage them along that skepticism, that path of skepticism, without, necessarily turning them off too quick. Some people you have to just argue with them, and you got to raise your voice because they're crazy or whatever, okay? But a lot of people, they're just misled. They just haven't heard. They haven't read what they need to read. They just haven't been exposed to the right kind of information. They're afraid to question. They don't think it's polite to question, So those kind of people, that's really beyond these books, this is how I kind of live my life. I just try to share information with people, and because I think the more we know and the wider we can open our eyes, the better world we can have. When people stop allowing themselves to just stumble and sleepwalk through life with all these delusions and all these lies in their head, I think we'd be better off.
I fully, fully agree. Well, I'm excited to read your next book then, because that sounds like it's right up my alley. And I really part of what I enjoyed about your books is what you say about the personal stories that you put in there about your own experiences, because I think that's something that really helps people relate to it as not being just a list of dry scientific facts, but this is how, real people live their lives and the kinds of interactions that we have. And that's what makes people relate. And I think that's important.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because that was my goal with these first two books, with 50 Reasons People Give for Believing in God and Race and Reality, both of them. I tried to make the science accessible to anyone. I I try to, when I bring in my personal experiences, I try to do it in a way that shows, hey, I'm not some genius up on an ivy tower. I'm not some wonderful human with all the answers, I'm not some know-it-all. I'm just a regular guy like you. I'm just a person out here trying to figure out the world and make my way through life. And I'm trying to inspire people to be bold and to think and to question and to be skeptics every day of their life, and to be science nerds, to find joy in science and to really clue in about what a wonderful, amazing, mysterious, horrible, exciting, beautiful, ugly, tragic, spectacular, gorgeous universe we live in, and to embrace it all and learn as much as they can and be excited. Because, you only live once. I think we only live once as far as the evidence says, but I think you've got to, make a good run at it and do the best you can to learn as much as you can and experience as much as you can. And that's what my books try to do. I'm trying to kind of bridge that gap between all that hard science and just the everyday people out there who need to hear that stuff. They need to know what the scientists are saying. They need to hear it. It's urgent. These are urgent messages because people are literally dying out there. Just last week I read about witches being beaten up and killed in India. Come on, witches. In the year 2010, witches are still being killed. This is crazy. The world desperately needs more science and more skepticism. Desperately.
Where can people go to find more resources to discuss your work or find out more about you online? How can they get in touch with you?
I have a website. It's pretty basic right now, but it's guyharrison.info. And there's an email address on there if anybody wants to go. There's some information about both of my books on that site. And and welcome emails. I get emails all the time, particularly from my first book. I get emails from people around the world that are very rewarding, actually. Many people who are sitting on the fence, Muslims, Hindus, Christians. I've heard from pretty much everybody out there, and they say that that first book, 50 Reasons, connected with them and kind of nudged them in a way where they're going to be more appreciative of science and be a lot more skeptical about the things that parents taught them and society taught them when they were young. So it's very rewarding. I think, that's why your job, the work you and Derek are doing is so important, because there really are people out there that want to hear this stuff. They're curious. They're ready and waiting, So the more you do, the more these podcasts you do, the better it is for the world. Because, oftentimes we might fall into the trap of thinking this is necessarily always a conflict and a debate between, the gullible and the skeptics, or the believers and the non-believers, or the creationists and the evolution acceptors. And actually, it's not always that. I think we underestimate how many people out there really do just, they're just kind of, they're working their jobs, they're going to school, they're thinking about their boyfriend or their girlfriend, and they just don't really have a whole lot of time for this. And if they hear you, out there on the web talking sense, it can really have a big impact on them and set them on the right course in life. That's why this stuff is so important. There are people out there that really want to hear and read about skepticism, and they want to know. They want to know more about science.
Well, and as you point out in both of your books, that it's for everyone, that it doesn't just touch, it touches people of every race, it touches people of every culture, and as you've pointed out, people around the world have contacted you. And so everybody's listening, and I think this is a great time to be able to send that message out to everyone. I'm so glad that you're writing these books, and I'll look forward to your next one, and thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks, Ruby. Yeah, I am on Facebook, so I encourage people just look me up on Facebook and connect with me, because I love sharing, science, skeptic news and stuff with people. So yeah, I'm Guy P. Harrison on Facebook. Yeah, just find me. Sloopy, thank you so much. You are an absolute world-class interviewer. It was a pleasure talking with you.
For those who might think that this program is yet another flight of my personal fancy-like discussions of speciesism and animal rights with Dr. Bekoff, consider these remarks that led to a great story that was linked on Wonkette and mentioned by MSNBC's Keith Olbermann just yesterday. In fact, one of Olbermann's worst people last night was John Derbyshire of the National Review. Speaking to the Black Law Students Association of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, Derbyshire said, quote, "We all notice the different physical specialties of the different races in the Olympic Games. There was a run of, I think, 7 Olympics in which every one of the finalists in the men's 100-meter sprint was of West African ancestry, 56 out of 56 finalists. You get less pronounced but similar patterns in other sports, East African distance runners, Northeast Asian divers, and so on. These differences even show up within sports, where a team sport calls for highly differentiated abilities in team members, football being the obvious example. We see the same differences in traits that we don't think of as directly physical, what evolutionary psychologists sometimes refer to as the BIP traits, behavior, intelligence, and personality. 2 of the hardest to ignore manifestations here are the extraordinary differentials in criminality between white Americans and African Americans and the persistent gaps in scores when tests of cognitive ability are given to large population samples." Unquote. Mr. Derbyshire needs to spend some time reading some science, perhaps starting with Race and Reality by Guy Harrison, and then for dessert, maybe Guns, Germs, and Steel by Dr. Jared Diamond. I suspect this is another show where I'm going to get lots of email. I love that, not because I'm a pot stirrer, but because the purpose of this program is, as it has been for the last 5 years, not for me to tell you what to think or what to believe, but to present the information that I've learned through my research and through the words of our guests, and for you to be inspired to want to learn more and ask more questions. As always, you can send feedback to us at feedback@skepticality.com. We do answer the emails personally and try to do so in a timely manner. You can also weigh in on our discussion forums. Derek spends quite a bit of time there, and our moderators, including our tireless volunteers headed by Dr. Mabuse, or as I know him, Michael, who I got to hug at Dragon Con but never spend any real time with, which is sad. I don't tend to like posting on forums or even in the comments of blogs because the arguing that often goes on makes me sad and makes my head all splody. I think I lack fortitude in this area. Many folks, certainly those who contribute on Bad Astronomy and Pharyngula and Skepchick and Skeptic Blog and Science-Based Medicine do, and there are great discussions that go on. I do better one-on-one, so send me an email, catch me on Facebook, and we'll talk. You can find out more about Guy Harrison at his website, guyharrison.info. That's GUYHARRISON.info. He's also on Facebook. He also told me that he's moving from his island home in the Caymans to the U.S. very soon, so maybe you can catch him at a skeptical meeting or conference near you. You can find out more about the Atlanta Skepticamp at the Atlanta Skeptics website and by doing a search for Atlanta Skeptics on meetup.com. There you'll find a wealth of groups for free thought, skepticism, science, and critical thinking in your area, so check that out. And for more information about creating or contributing to a Skepticamp in your area, go to skepticamp.org. You can find links to all the sources of information for this program and past episodes, and if you can't find them, tell me and we'll add them. I do all this stuff manually in the dark of night, and so when stuff gets missed, I want to fix it. And your help is greatly appreciated. You can find it all on our website at
www.skepticality.com.
Do it again.
www.skepticality.com.
Awesome.
Join our discussion forums at www.skepticality.com. Leave feedback by email at feedback